Welcome to Beyond Inventory Optimization, a webcast series that focuses on hot topics around supply chain excellence and inventory optimization. You will be able to view these webcasts anytime online. I'll give you the URL at the end of the show. So let's get started. Today we're bringing you part 2 of my recent conversation with Dr. Sean Willems. We discussed the new role that inventory must play now that we're starting to see an upswing in demand, revenue goals, and customer service targets. Senior executives are shifting their focus from inventory cutting to how can we grow faster than our competition. As we mentioned last time, Sean's groundbreaking research at MIT created many of the inventory optimization techniques and tools that are now in daily use at leading manufacturers around the world. So let's get back to my wide-ranging interview with Dr. Sean.
Well, that's cool. The other thing I'm seeing is that when you go in to have these conversations, you have to explain to the managers that not all inventory is created equal, and there's actually some inventory out there that you can't touch. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and this is certainly one of the most difficult problems, I'd say, to solve. So, as you get higher in the company, you have fewer wheels to turn or fewer levers to pull, but they do more things. And I'd say a senior executive's take initially is that all inventory is the same, they just want it reduced. Unfortunately, that's simply not true. At the very least, there's a couple major classifications of inventory that we need as a supply chain team to educate senior management about. This isn't to try to overcomplicate the problem, but just to represent it in the complexity that's needed to improve things. So one is safety stock, the one we all sort of think of in regards to variability. But there's also pipeline stock just due to your lead times and cycle policies and review frequencies in the supply chain. There's also dead stock, right? Just stuff from old products, obsolete items. If we just think of these 3 buckets of inventory, we can't have the same policy for all of them. What we really have to do is measure each one separately, just like any quality control or SPC type initiative, and we really need to get people to look at safety stock differently than pipeline stock, differently than dead stock.
And also to understand the interrelation between pipeline stock and cycle stock in the factory.
So there definitely are tools for these and an ability to get more granular to understand these, because that's where the improvement's got to come. If we just sit there and say, hey, you have $100 million in inventory, improve it, well, we all know there's sort of enough sort of slop in the system that can be hard to pin down the source of. We have to take it down one level, measure each of these, and then say, this is how you improve them. And it's actually no different than the way people manage, say, overtime or logistics costs. It's actually not overly burdensome. It's just a necessary step to improve.
You and I are old enough to have been through a few economic cycles, but I'm noticing this time around there's a set of early movers who started doing this 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more, that now sort of have a baseline competency that they can use the tools to manage the economic cycles a lot better.
I think you're exactly right. We've also been around long enough to know that most of this stuff ultimately reduces to people, process, technology. How do you get a good improvement? Well, you merge people, process, and technology. And we do see that I think the real visionary companies have put people in place that are looking, so they have planners that are responsible for both production and inventory. So inventory is no longer just an output of the process, but it's actually a conscious input in the sense of an inventory target they're running to. So they've put people in place that manage inventory and production and capacity and service all together versus just, say, 1 or 2 of them and letting the others be outputs. They've also put in place technology that actually lets them focus on the exceptions. Because the problem is, given how little time and resources people have, there's no way to manage all the SKUs. And you can't look every day and look at every SKU. So we need a set of the SKUs to just manage themselves or manage against rules we've established, and then let the planners use their expertise to focus on the critical problems. That's what we see the good companies doing.
So that's an interesting conversation I always get into with managers and executives too, which is, what do I need to do to my organization?
The difficulty I find in giving a good answer is it is company culture specific on the one hand, but it's also not that hard to see what the answer is. we know we can't significantly break the processes that we already have in place at the company. And what I mean by this is, if you're a really huge company, people tend to stay in job roles for like 2 to 3 years. If you're in a smaller company, someone might stay in a role for 5 to 10 years. So that underlying cycle we have to keep in mind. But with that cycle, we need to match the process to the people. So we need to say, if inventory is a big problem at this company, a $100 million problem, then we need to put in place infrastructure that lets the team make these decisions, better inventory decisions. That doesn't need to be super heavy and bureaucratic, but we just can't say, hey, here's a new tool and, go make it work. We have to have them allocate time to establishing different inventory policies.
The original companies we worked with were very organized, and they had some centralized structure to drive this sort of thing. What I'm finding now is that as inventory optimization becomes a mature science, we're getting into not necessarily the early adopters, but the early majority. And those folks tend to have more distributed operations. So there might not be a corporate structure. It may be at the business unit, and there may not be anybody who has that name badge on to do supply chain planning. I mean, what do you say to those folks?
It's a good realization, and how they need to solve that is by starting small and then branching out. So I tend to think of this as, what's the scope and granularity? Usually when people come in and think about supply chain, they think of this vast end-to-end thing. But if we're starting in one of these early majority customers, then what we want to do is have a smaller scope. Because you can still get tremendous benefit just by managing, say, your distribution system forward or all your raw materials into distribution, right? Like 1/2 of your supply chain. That usually rolls up to a single person in the company, so it's much easier to make those changes to sort of half the chain versus the entire chain. So that's how I would begin with some of these smaller companies. And you can get really significant wins because it's most likely that no one has deeply quantify those inventory targets before. So there's pretty fertile ground to work on.
Okay, I got one last question for you and one last theme. I had an interesting exercise where I was going through benefits and risks and pains for our marketplace and trying to line them up with who in the companies that we work with cares about those. What I found was the majority of the stuff that we see as benefits and pains lined up under a supply chain heading or under an operations heading, and sometimes under an IT heading. But I saw very little that aligned with like a CFO. Why does a CFO or a CEO, or, in some of these gigantic companies we work with, it would be a business unit VP, right? Why do they care? What is the pain that's going to get them to say, this is something I need to be worried about on my personal agenda?
It's a great question because, at the end of the day, we all know if we're in this rarefied era of this sort of CXO space where they're only going to have 3 priorities in a given year, right? And it's going to be laser focused on what's the ROI of those opportunities. If we come in and say, hey, it's going to take 6 months to save $500,000, that's not going to be very interesting. So we need to have an initiative that's important enough to crack that top 3. In most of the companies we work with, the good news is that's absolutely true, that we can be in that top 3. And how we do it depends on the different industry, but certainly if there's big dollars in inventory, then it's, I'd say, a very slam dunk sort of easy story to tell. But what we see right now, particularly at this executive level, is that they're much more focused on top-line growth. And so the story really becomes much more around the right service to provide. And so, in effect, inventory is a detail. We all know from the supply chain side that it's an important detail, that you can't do one without the other. But on some level, that's not the story to tell. The story to tell is you're trying to grow this year by 10%, by 8%, by 12%, right, organically. Okay, what's the right way to do that? Well, the right way to do that is we have to deploy enough in the field so that we don't have stuff in the wrong spot. I think that's really the message that resonates with people. Okay, we're going to put this inventory in the field. How do we put it in the right place? That's the message I see them get really excited about because they know it's sort of one of the things that irritates them, right? They know they've got inventory on their books, but yet they hear they're having stockouts in certain places. And at the level they are in the company, it's sort of like, why is that? I'm not trying to go in and solve it myself. I just want to understand why others can't solve it. And this is a good way to solve it. We can go in very clearly and say, we can balance inventory across the supply chain to provide higher service.
Time phase proactively with your business plan. So if you're planning this growth out over the next 12 months, here's how we're going to ramp to that. I'm getting excited too, Sean. We should solve this problem. All right, I think we're coming to the end of our leash here.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you.
Okay, that's it for episode 6, my very interesting, forward-looking conversation with Dr. Sean Willems. Now we can see how crucially important inventory optimization is to achieving organic growth and creating a competitive edge at the same time. A lot of great insight there about the golden opportunity we all have to grow more competitive and to add to the top line as business comes roaring back. My thanks to Sean for his great contribution today. Beyond Inventory Optimization is sponsored by Logility, a leader in software solutions for inventory optimization. We hope you'll take a look at Logility's website, download some of our white papers on various supply chain topics, and see how inventory optimization can free up working capital, reduce inventory, handle uncertain demand with confidence, and raise your customer service levels while actually cutting supply chain costs. Just go to www.logility.com. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Beyond Inventory Optimization.